Seraphine Voss had learned one thing very early in her life. The most powerful position in any room was the one nobody was watching. For 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, she had carried basins of water through the east corridor of Ashvale Palace. She had polished floors that nobody thanked her for. She had refilled oil lamps in rooms where powerful people spoke freely, because powerful people never bothered to look at the girl holding the lamp. She had a number stitched into the collar of her servant's uniform. Not a name, a number. Tonight, that was going to change. The palace was carved into the belly of a great northern mountain, and its stone walls had stood for 400 years. It was the seat of Queen Morrigan Ashvale, the alpha queen of the northern wolf packs, a woman so feared that even the wind seemed to move more carefully around her. She had ruled for 40 years. She had crushed every rival who had ever dared look at her throne with hungry eyes. Her word was law, her silence was a warning, and her sacred crown, an ancient piece of dark gold set with stones that burned deep red in the light, was said to be bound to her by forces older than the palace itself. Nobody had ever taken it from her. Nobody had ever thought to try. Seraphine set her basin of water down on the corridor floor, straightened her back, and walked toward the vault. She had not always been this calm. There was a time, years ago, when she was a frightened child being pulled away from the burning remains of her small village, dragged toward a palace she had never seen, given a uniform she had never asked for. Her mother had been human. Her father had been a rogue wolf, a wolf who belonged to no pack and was claimed by none. That made Seraphine nothing in the eyes of pack society. No rank, no bloodline worth mentioning, no wolf gene of her own. She could not shift. She could not fight the way they fought. She had no natural power that anyone could measure or fear. But she had her eyes, and she had her memory. And in a palace full of people who never looked at the servant girl, those two things had become the sharpest tools she had ever held. She learned the palace the way a river learns the land it runs through, slowly, quietly, and completely. She memorized which guard left his post 11 minutes early to visit the kitchen. She knew which hallway the queen never used because of a draft that bothered her old shoulder injury. She knew which vault hinges were worn, and which stone wall behind the crown's display case had a thin crack where cold air moved, meaning there was a passage behind it that nobody had used in a very long time. She also knew the old law. The one Elder Draven had recited to himself one evening in the archive room, believing he was completely alone. Attus Tibiduza. He had not been alone. Seraphine had been on the other side of a tall shelf, replacing scrolls, silent as she always was. She had heard every word the old man spoke in his quiet, careful voice. He had recited it like a prayer he had been keeping in his chest for years. The sacred crown of Ashvale holds no loyalty to bloodline. It holds loyalty to the one who claims it in the hour the moon withholds her light. For in that hour, the wolves cannot shift, and the crown chooses not rank, but will. She had stood very still behind that shelf for a long time after he finished. Then she had gone back to replacing scrolls, finished her task, and walked out of the archive room without making a single sound. That night, lying on her thin mat in the servant quarters, she had begun to plan. 6 months of careful, invisible work had brought her to this corridor, on this moonless night, with everything in place. The vault was guarded by 2 men who had stood the same post for 2 years and had grown comfortable in the belief that nothing ever happened here. They were professionals, but comfort is the enemy of alertness, and Seraphine had understood that long before tonight. She did not need to deal with them herself. That was Zale's part. Commander Zale was the Queen's head enforcer, a tall, quiet man with iron-gray eyes, who had spent 15 years carrying out Morrigan's orders without complaint. He was loyal to the throne. That was the important distinction. Not to the woman, to the throne. And Seraphine had seen the difference clearly on the 3 occasions she had watched him witness the Queen execute innocent pack members for political reasons. His jaw had tightened each time. His hands had stayed still at his sides, but his jaw had tightened. She had not approached him directly. She was not reckless. Over 2 months she had simply left things where he would find them. A copied scroll with the old law written out in clean, careful handwriting, a small map with a single corridor marked, and finally, 1 sentence on a folded piece of parchment placed inside his patrol boot one morning. The throne is not the Queen. He had found her 3 days later in the east corridor, while she was on her knees polishing the floor. He had crouched down, pretending to inspect something on the wall nearby, and without looking at her, he had asked one question in a voice barely above a breath. When? She had told him. The next moonless night. He had stood up and walked away without another word. He had not reported her, and that told her everything she needed to know. The 2 guards at the vault entrance went down quietly and without harm, and Seraphine did not stop to watch. She moved through the vault door and into the room beyond. The vault was cold and lit by 2 low-burning torches on the far wall. The crown sat in a sealed glass case in the center of the room, on a pedestal of dark stone. She had been in this room once before, 4 months ago, under the cover of her cleaning duties. She had studied the case, she had noted the lock, she had not touched the crown that day. Tonight, she crossed the room without hesitation, opened the case with the key she had spent 3 months arranging access to, and lifted the crown from its place. The palace shook. It was not a violent shaking, not the kind caused by an earthquake or an explosion. It was deeper than that, and stranger. It was the kind of trembling that comes from something very old being disturbed after a very long sleep. The torches in the vault room blazed high for one moment, then dropped low again. The red stones in the crown flared bright in her hands, and then, very slowly, they turned white. Far above her, in the Queen's private chamber, Morrigan Ashvale sat straight up in her bed. Her face went pale, her hands flew to her head, searching for something that was no longer there, though she had not been wearing the crown to sleep. She felt its absence the way a person feels the cold when a door is opened in winter, immediate and full body. She understood what it meant before her mind caught up with her instincts. She was already moving toward the door. Seraphine placed the crown on her head in the empty vault room, alone, with no witnesses, except the stone walls and the 2 low torches. She had imagined this moment many times during the long months of planning, and she had always imagined she might feel something dramatic, fear or triumph, or relief so powerful it would bring her to her knees. Instead, she felt the crown settle against her head, the way something settles when it finally stops moving after a very long journey. There was a warmth that moved from the metal, down through her temples, across her shoulders, and down her spine, not painful, just certain, like a door closing firmly, like a question being answered. She was still standing exactly like that when Morrigan arrived. The Queen came through the vault door in her nightclothes, her long silver hair loose, her eyes sharp and blazing with fury, without her crown, without her formal robes, without the trappings of 4 decades of rule. She was simply a tall woman in her 60s, with a very powerful anger, and no way to reach the power she was used to wielding. On a moonless night, she could not shift. Her wolf strength was muted, her senses dulled. She was formidable still. She was not a woman who was ever simply nothing, but she was not what she had been an hour ago. She stopped when she saw Seraphine. Her eyes moved to the crown. The silence lasted a long time. Then Morrigan spoke, and her voice was controlled and cold and sharp as broken stone. She spoke about bloodlines and law and the natural order of things. She spoke about what happened to those who reached above their station. She spoke about rogue blood and human mothers, and what Seraphine was and was not. She spoke with great authority and great certainty, and every word was designed to make the girl in front of her feel small. Seraphine listened to all of it. Then she said, very quietly, "You are speaking to a queen." Morrigan moved toward her, 1 step, then 2. Her hand reached out toward the crown. The stones blazed white. Morrigan stopped as if she had walked into a wall she could not see. She did not fall. She did not cry out. But she stopped, and the fury in her face shifted into something that looked briefly, and only briefly, like fear. Then her legs gave way, and she sat down hard against the vault wall, staring. Zale appeared in the doorway. He looked at Morrigan on the floor. He looked at Seraphine standing in the center of the room, with the crown on her head, and her hands at her sides and her chin level. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he went down on one knee. The remaining hours before dawn were spent carefully. Morrigan was moved to a lower chamber, not a cell, not a dungeon, but a room with a bed and a locked door. Seraphine gave specific instructions that she was to be treated with basic dignity. She understood that how a new ruler treats a fallen one, tells everyone watching exactly what kind of ruler they are dealing with. She intended everyone watching to understand very clearly what kind of ruler she was. Elder Draven appeared in the corridor outside the vault before the first hour had passed. He was old and slow, and he walked with a carved wooden staff, but his eyes were clear, and they were wet when they found Seraphine. He stood looking at her for a long moment, with an expression that was not exactly surprise. It was closer to the face of a man who has been waiting for a specific train and is finally watching it arrive. He told her everything, the full history of the crown and the law attached to it. The way Morrigan had come to power not through the crown's choosing, but through simple physical dominance at a moment when the law had been forgotten and nobody had been present to invoke it. He told her he had known for a long time that Morrigan's claim had a crack in its foundation. He had waited. He had watched. He had wanted to be certain. Seraphine asked him why he had not acted himself years ago. He looked at her steadily and said, because the one meant to hold that crown needed to know every corridor, every lock, every crack in every wall. You needed time, and the crown needed to be sure of you. She thought about that. Then she nodded once and turned to the business of the morning. The senior pack commanders were assembled in the great hall before the sky had fully lightened. There were 11 of them, and they were a collection of large, proud, powerful individuals who had spent their careers answering to one person and one person only. Walking into that hall to face them was the most difficult thing Seraphine had done since lifting the crown from its case. She did not let that show. She stood at the front of the room, with Zale on her right and Elder Draven on her left, and she let them look at her. She let them take in what they were seeing. A young woman with no pack name and no wolf gene standing in front of them, wearing the sacred crown of Ashvale. She watched the emotions move across their faces: disbelief, anger, calculation. One of them, a broad commander named Harwick, who had served under Morrigan for 22 years, reached slowly for the weapon at his side. The crown pulsed once. Warm, quiet, certain. Harwick's hand stopped. He did not draw the weapon. He looked at the crown for a moment with an expression of great reluctance, and then he moved his hand back to his side. Seraphine spoke. She did not speak about destiny. She did not speak about the crown choosing her, or about ancient laws and mystical forces. Though all of those things were true, she spoke about 3 people. She spoke about a young pack member named Corin, who had been executed 2 years ago for speaking against one of the Queen's trade decisions. She spoke about a woman named Leia, who had been put to death for protecting her daughter from a punishment the Queen had ordered. She spoke about an elder named Pitt, who had questioned a border ruling and had never been seen again after that. She spoke their names clearly in the quiet hall, and she let the names sit in the air. She watched the faces in front of her change. Not all of them, and not all at once, but the room shifted. Something that had been locked in the chests of those 11 commanders, something that had been pressed down and kept down for a very long time, moved. One by one, beginning with Zale and ending with Harwick, the commanders of the northern wolf packs lowered their heads. Seraphine walked out through the main gates of Ashvale Palace as the sky turned the deep, quiet blue that comes just before sunrise. The air outside was cold and sharp, and she breathed it in slowly. She did not leave the palace. She stepped outside it for the first time, as something other than invisible. The crown was on her head. The stones were calm and dark red in the early morning darkness, no longer blazing, just present. She stood in the wide stone courtyard, and she looked up at the sky, where the first gray-pink light was beginning to appear at the very edge of the mountain horizon. She thought about the basin of water she had left in the east corridor. She thought about 11 days of counting. She thought about a shelf full of scrolls, and an old man reciting a law to an empty room. She thought about her number, stitched into the collar of a uniform she would never wear again. The wolves of Ashvale Palace, those who had already shifted in the new light of the returning morning, began to howl. The sound rose up from the courtyards and the towers, and the mountain slopes around them, and it filled the cold air completely. Seraphine stood still, and let it wash over her. She had known she would win. She had simply been patient enough to wait until the palace figured that out too.